Last week, we talked about church discipline. What to do when you realize that your brother is in sin. And we did this from Matthew chapter 18, in which Jesus gave the instructions that if you see that your brother sins, you go to him in private, the two of you alone. If that doesn't reconcile things, then you go with a couple others also, so that they can be witnesses of the discussion and determine whether or not there's validity to your belief that your brother's in sin. And if, on the basis of two or three witnesses, it is found that that is the case, the church, so that the church can then appeal to this individual. And if the church as a whole is not able to appeal to this individual and bring them back into a right relationship with God, then Jesus says, treat such a one as a Gentile or a tax collector. Now, remember, the whole point of it was to win your brother and to save somebody who has gone into error. That's the focus. That's the goal. That's what we're trying to accomplish. Well, I said last week we would be continuing the discussion in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 because this scripture, as well as the reading indicates, is certainly a part of this discussion. As we continue to remind ourselves that the only way that we can be a true church together, that others would want to be a part of, a church that glorifies God and glorifies Christ, then we need to be a church that handles itself according to the Word of God in all things. And as we've talked about before, if we might someday find ourselves having to engage in some kind of church discipline, we should make sure that we understand how to do so appropriately. And we want to make sure we don't mess it up. So this morning, I want to continue our discussion looking at Paul's instructions to the Corinthian church when he said to remove such a one. Good morning. It's good to be here this morning, isn't it? It's good to sing these songs together. It's good for us to enjoy the fellowship that we share as we eat the Lord's Supper together, as we proclaim the Lord's death, as we continue to await for him to come, and just to enjoy the fellowship that we share as God's people together. The importance of these relationships that we have, that I have with you, that you have with one another, and the family atmosphere that we are able to have here as a group of God's people. It is indeed a wonderful thing to be here with you. And for those of you who are visiting with us, we're really glad that you have decided to be with us this morning and that you have chosen to be here with us. It makes us feel pretty special. We're glad you're here. And we hope that you will feel encouraged by the time that you spend with us, as well as those of you who are joining with us online. As we look into 1 Corinthians chapter 5, I think, first of all, to make sure that we understand the point that he's getting across, Paul is not writing 1 Corinthians chapter 5 to the man that's going to be under discussion. I think, as we see this, that will become very clear. This is not an indictment of that man. Paul says that man should have already been indicted by you. This is an indictment on how the church is handling this particular individual. Now, if that doesn't make sense right now, hopefully it will by the time we get through. But I think it is important that we at least understand this. The problem that Paul's addressing is not the man himself who is in the illicit relationship. The problem is the boasting of the church who has done nothing about it, but instead seems to brag about it. So realizing the critique is on the church, not necessarily the man, let's look at exactly what it is we're dealing with in this section. Now, this was just read for us just a moment ago, these first 5 verses right here. And the first thing that I really want to focus in on and make sure that we see, he says, it's actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you that is a kind not even tolerated even among pagans. This is an egregious type of a sin. There's a man here that says has his father's wife, that is engaging in sexual relationships at best with his stepmother or possibly with his own mother. And that's the way that Paul is deciding to write this. Whether this refers to a marriage relationship with this woman or if they're just cohabiting is not clear. The assumption here, I believe, is that the father has passed and that he's no longer a part of this picture. But really the particulars, as I said just a second ago, are not the main point. They set up the main point that Paul's getting across. The main point is that there is a sinfulness going on with members of the church there in Corinth. There's a sinfulness that is so bad, even the Gentiles would look at it and say, oh man, that is messed up right there. Even the Gentiles who don't have a moral code that's delivered to them from the books of the law or from the rest of the prophets or anything else, there's no moral code from Jesus, all of that. Even they are able to look at it and say, yeah, that's wrong. That is horrific. This is a sinful behavior let me put it this way. There is sinful behavior, and then this takes us up to another notch. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying, right? Is every sin a sin? Yes. Everybody heard me say that, right? Does sin separate from God? Yes, every sin separates from God. I am not suggesting that there are some sins in God's eyes that are worse than others as far as whether this sin can separate you from God or not. What I am suggesting is that there are some sins that are worse in the sight of the world, and these are the sins which bring reproach and bring shame upon the church, and by extension, they bring reproach and shame upon God himself. Open and blatant sexual immorality is one of those. And we're going to see later, Paul's going to add a few more to this list, so I'm going to reserve the rest of the conversation until then. But we just know moving forward, Paul is not just discussing here sinful actions in general. He's really talking about something that is so egregious, and it is so blatant and open and noticeable by the Gentiles that I believe it means it's an ongoing, continual type of sin as well, something that is so horrible that the Gentiles notice it. And what Paul says is he has already pronounced judgment on this individual. Let me say that again. Paul has already pronounced judgment on this individual. That's pretty arrogant of Paul, isn't it? I mean, he just goes out there and pronounces judgment. Who does he think he is, really? Is he God? Does he have the power and the authority of God to pronounce judgment on somebody? And let me suggest, before we give an oft abused, I believe, trite answer that says, well, he is an apostle and has the Holy Spirit, so yeah, he has powers, that we must not have. Let me suggest the gifts of the Holy Spirit, even given to the apostles, were limited. And they did not make them gods on earth. They did not give them the power to pronounce God's judgment in this way. No, Paul does not have the authority of God to pronounce eternal judgment on someone. And it seemed here, is he not in direct violation of Matthew chapter 7 and verse 1, in which Jesus very specifically says, do not judge, lest you be judged. Seems pretty egregious on Paul's part, does it not? To very specifically say, I have pronounced judgment, condemnation on this person. Now, there are some people here who might be thinking, Chris, you actually just made a decently strong case to show that Paul is guilty of judging in the way that Jesus says not to do. But, Chris, we also know that you like to make statements like this and then pull a 180 and show how what you said may not have been the case. So let's see how you get out of this one. Well, if in Matthew chapter 7:1 all that Jesus says is do not judge, then Paul is absolutely in violation of what's written by, or what's said by Jesus, written by Matthew. But that's not all that Jesus says. He says, do not judge lest you be judged, because in the way that you judge, you will be judged. And then remember, he follows it up with the analogy of the speck and the log. These were people under consideration in Matthew chapter 7. These Pharisees, these were individuals who had big old logs sticking out of their eyes in the analogy, and they were trying to get little specks out of somebody else's eye. And Jesus says, look, y'all are a bunch of hypocrites in the way that you're judging. You are focusing on minor details of someone else, and you are ignoring the big sinful problems of yourself. And if that's the way you're going to judge, do not judge, because you're going to be judged in kind, and the judgment you receive with this big old plank sticking out of your eye, it's not going to be good. That's the message that Jesus is delivering in Matthew chapter 7. Is that the situation here? Would a judgment here on a man who is cohabiting, maybe even married to his stepmom or mother, an incestual type of relationship, the kind of which the Gentiles even, just kind of scorn and say that type of thing should not happen? Would judgment here be a hypocritical judgment where the one who has the greater offense is judging the one with the lesser offense? I would suggest no. What's going on in Matthew chapter 7 when Jesus says this is not the case of what's taking place in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Everyone who hears about this man sleeping, basically, as the law of Moses says, sleeping with his mother, whether it's his stepmother, mother or not, it's sharing the flesh of his father is the idea. Everyone who hears about this is judging this man. Even the pagans who hear about this are judging this man. The only people who are not judging this man in the egregious sinful act that he's in are the very people who are in a position to help him get out of it. They're the ones ignoring it and refusing to judge him, allowing him to simply continue in that sinfulness without any problems and continue to do it assuming that everything is still hunky-dory. We cannot allow Matthew chapter 7 to be used in such a way that no sin ever gets acknowledged. Because quite frankly, every one of us, we understand we have all sinned. We, using it, Paul's statement in Romans chapter 3 incorrectly, the way that I said that it gets used incorrectly all the time in my Romans class, well, I'm going to do it again. We've all fallen short, right, of God's glory. We understand that. We're all in the same scenario, but that doesn't mean that when we see sin taking place, that we have no responsibility to say something about it. Sometimes, as the church, we are the only hope that an individual has. That's who we are. See, this is an individual who's refusing to acknowledge that there is sinfulness. The sinfulness needs to be corrected, and all the rest of the world is able to look at it and see it, but the rest of the world is not going to correct that sinfulness. See, this is not a speck in a log scenario that Jesus portrayed from Matthew chapter 7. This is a massive log sticking out of the eye of the man, and really everyone in the church, by extension, because they're doing nothing about it. And so Paul is calling them all out on it. And let me just kind of side note as well here, in case we get wrapped up in the, well, Paul's an apostle, and as an apostle, he is given certain liberties that we don't have. He's given certain rights. He's given certain authority that we don't have. Therefore, he's allowed to pronounce judgment in a way that we're not allowed to. What is his critique of these Corinthian brethren? The critique, he says, is that you have not pronounced judgment on him. Paul expected them, before this moment, Paul expected them to have already pronounced judgment as a church. He's basically saying to them, y'all don't need an apostle to come here to point out how bad this sinfulness is. It is so bad that you should have seen it, and y'all should have already judged him, and y'all should have already done something about it. This is not, as I said before, this is not written to the man. This is not written to the father's wife, although as awkward as it might be, they very well may have been sitting there as this letter was read to the church, and here they are in the midst of it. But it's not written to them. This is written to the church because the church did not do what the church was supposed to do. They should have judged him. And Paul is saying, this is what you should have done. Paul is not condemning this man by the authority of being an apostle. Paul is saying that a group of Christians should be able to see when this kind of sinfulness is present, and they should know that they need to condemn such an individual. Paul says, before I even wrote this, you should have removed this man from your group. Paul says that he needs to be delivered to Satan for the destruction of the flesh so that the spirit may be saved. Now, this is perhaps one of those bugaboo verses that causes so much consternation as people try to figure out exactly what is Paul talking about. What does it mean to deliver someone over to Satan? I mean, that's what Paul says. I delivered him to Satan for the destruction of his flesh. Well, first of all, let me tell you what it does not mean. This does not mean that Satan is working for God in some kind of a way that, Satan is doing this under, God's direction so that we can send somebody to Satan. Satan will do his job and then send him back in some way, shape, or form. Some people take that viewpoint from what's here, and I think that's a gross misapplication of what is going on. I think this really is just simple as the phrase that Paul uses in Romans chapter 1 when he says, when the error of the Gentiles got so bad, God simply gave them over or gave them up to whatever it is that they were doing. Whatever they wanted to pursue, he didn't stop, he didn't hinder them. And here it is, I think that principle is with an individual. If a person decides to follow Satan in their actions while they're still a part of the church, then that person should not do so under the guise of one who's following Christ. In other words, if you, and I know this, every analogy breaks down, so just take it for what it is, but if you found out in your government that there was somebody working in your government who was a part of a different government as a spy or something like that, you're not just going to sit there and allow this person to continue working in your government, right? You're going to get him out. You're going to send him back, deliver him back to where he came and say, look, you're working for them, not us. To them you go. And I think that's the idea. Someone who is trying to be a minister of Satan and yet at the same time is trying to be a church of the Lord Jesus Christ, he is unable to do both at the same time. And when you realize that, you send him back where he belongs. Send him back to Satan. This is a man living a lie. He's living for Satan and all that Satan stands for, and yet he claims to be living for Jesus, and it makes the church and it makes Jesus look bad. And so Paul says, as far as he's concerned, if he works for Satan, to Satan he goes. And what's the purpose? The purpose is the destruction of the flesh, which really troubled me for a long time, trying to figure out, what does this mean? The destruction of the flesh. It sounds like he's saying, well, send him out there so he'll die, so that the flesh will get destroyed, and then that way his soul will be saved. And a lot of this stems from, I think, a misunderstanding of the terms flesh and spirit, one that I carried for I don't know how many years, that just made this very difficult. I always assumed it had to do with substance, that the flesh is the physical body. And so, this idea of destroying the flesh leads to salvation of the soul in some way, and it just didn't sit right. But this isn't about flesh, the body, versus spirit, which is non-corporeal. Remember, we've talked about this recently in our Romans class. When he talks about the flesh and the spirit, he's talking about your attitude, the way that you live your life. That you either are going to live your life in a way that you will follow the desires of the things of this world, or you will live your life to follow the desires of the one who created this world before it was tainted by sin in its perfected state. You're going to follow then the desires of the Spirit and walk by the Spirit, not walk by the things to fulfill the flesh. What we have here is one who is trying to do the things that would please his own flesh while maintaining hypocritically that he's actually desiring to please the Spirit. And the hope is that by fully indulging himself in the flesh, I think the idea is that he'll actually not just experience the things of the flesh that are pleasurable and enjoyable, the things that make the things of the flesh tempting, but that he will also experience the parts of that lifestyle and way of doing things that makes it why God says, don't do that. There's a reason that God prohibits living in certain ways, because down that path, you're going to run into all kinds of problems and issues. Take, for instance, the parable that Jesus told of the wasteful son, or the prodigal son, the one who took his inheritance and threw it all out. What happened? Eventually, that lifestyle caught up with him. His resources ran out. There was a famine. He gave himself to feeding pigs and started actually being envious of what pigs, these unclean animals, were eating, and wishing that he could eat as well as the pigs are eating. Well, what if the father had found out what was going on, the father of the prodigal, the wasteful son, and said, oh man, I'm just going to send him a weekly allowance so he doesn't have to live like that, so he doesn't have to live among the pigs. Would that have changed that son? Would he have ever come to his senses if the father would have continued to enable that behavior by just simply continuing to say, that's okay, whatever you're doing, I'm going to give you what you need to continue to live in it? Well, no. He had to hit a point that was rock bottom so that he could come to his senses and come out of it. I think that's what Paul's discussing right here. The destruction of his flesh is allowing him to go down that path of feeding, desiring the flesh, doing all that's there, to the point that eventually he would hit rock bottom. This is a phrase that's often used, tough love. This tough love is the only way that he might actually come out of his sinfulness. What Paul expects is for the Christians to take a stand against this sinfulness, to show sinfulness for what it is, and if needs be, tell a person, if you want to continue to follow Satan and not Jesus, you're not allowed to pretend that you are a Jesus follower with us anymore. And it's a choice that the individual has to make. Now again, the charge here is against the church, not the man. Paul is taking it, I believe, as a foregone conclusion that the man has already been indicted. You see this as you keep on going. Starting verse 6, he says, your boasting is not good. Do you not know a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. The picture is almost as if they knew. Everyone knew just how wrong this was. And by the way, there are a few people in the church in Corinth who are trying to stand up against it. There are some people in Corinth who are trying to point out that it's wrong. That's the only way that Paul hears about this. Probably from the people he calls Chloe's people, or the people who have come from Chloe that are talked about there in the beginning of the letter. So it's not as if every single person necessarily goes along with it, but it's also obvious throughout the letter that Chloe's people are a minority that has been kind of snuffed out by the majority. And they haven't been given a voice, because they have no voice in the letter that they send to Paul. They have to go separately and state their case. So Paul tells them it's not Christ-like to simply ignore sinfulness in the church, as much as some people may think it is. It is not a Christ-like spirit that says, you may be in sin, but I've sinned before too, and who am I to judge? God loves you just the way that you are. There is no need to change your sinful habits. That is not a Christ-like spirit. That does not follow Jesus, who told the woman, go and sin no more. In fact, Paul makes it very clear this kind of acceptance of sin is only going to lead to more sin within the group. As more people become comfortable with sin and having it among the group, he calls it leaven, the way that leaven spreads. A common way that we describe this today. One bad apple will spoil the entire bunch of apples. It's the same idea. A little leaven is going to spread through to all of the lump of dough. Here, he calls Jesus the Passover lamb. And I don't know if he does this because it's just an apt statement, which I'm sure it is, or maybe, just maybe, they are right in the middle of or very close to the Passover celebration as he's writing this. And since there are Jews there, and really all of the church would have understood the Passover, it was part of the teaching from the Scriptures, this is an apt statement to draw this connection at the time. But he makes sure that they know that as they celebrate a Passover, and we'll talk about the Passover, by the way, in a couple months as it rolls around, Christians celebrate the true Passover, the deliverance from the true evil masters of sin that we are enslaved to. And he says, throw out the leaven of sinfulness in the same way that they threw out the leaven of Egypt in those days. So starting verse 9, he says, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the sexually immoral of this world, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. But now, as I'm writing to you, not to associate with anyone who bears the name of a brother if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, swindler, not even to eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges those outside. Purge the evil person from among you. Now, just very, very briefly, I wrote in my letter, I don't know if any of you all noticed that, and maybe some question marks might have come up, because if you recall, we are reading 1 Corinthians, which would give the impression this is the first letter that Paul sent to the Corinthians. And apparently, this is not the first letter that Paul sent to the Corinthians. He has sent one before. And just very briefly, that shouldn't cause any issues or problems. Nothing says that we have to have everything that Paul wrote, or that everything Paul wrote is valuable to us. In fact, right here, I think we're given the information from that previous letter that would be valuable to us, because he says, this is what I wrote. Do not associate with sexually immoral people. And so we have here this command that was given to them, and considering how much of a topic sexual immorality is in the next few chapters, I don't think they listened very well. But he makes it very clear in these instructions about refraining from association, refusing to associate yourself with, separating oneself from. All of this is all about unruly people within the church. This is not a matter of disassociating with people not a part of the church. You can see the difference, right? He's only talking about not associating with people who are acting as if they are a part of the church itself. People who are outside, they live by a different standard. They haven't accepted the standard of the new covenant. They haven't agreed to the terms and said, we're going to live by this. Therefore, Paul says, you can't hold them accountable to it in the same way as far as fellowship goes. It's our job to be beacons of light to them and to leave the judging for them to God. It's not our job to go and to judge them in the way that they're living and what they're doing. Our job focuses on what's going on within the church. How else are those outside of the church supposed to see the light of Christ if we disassociate with them and make ourselves into some kind of reclusive commune that only serves ourselves? But he told them, when there are people in the church who are trying to maintain fellowship with the church and yet living in blatant sexual immorality, like this man with his father's wife, these are the ones you disassociate with. Paul also says, beyond just sexual immorality, he says those who are involved in greed, idolatry, those who are, if he's a reviler, a drunkard, a swindler. I think these are kind of chosen because these are the very things that made Christians distinct from the rest of the world. These are the things that Christians followed that the rest of the world, the pagan world, did not. And these are the things that the pagan world would look at and say, oh, if you're a Christian, I know what Christians do or don't do, and you should not be acting this way. Or you should be doing these things that you are not doing. See, people in the world can see when someone's engaged in sexual immorality. People of the world are able to determine when somebody is greedy, or when they swindle, or when they engage in idolatry, when they're drunk. Christians refrained from these things. And so if anybody's doing any of these and egregiously doing it and refuses to change, we cannot allow that person to continue to represent the church of Christ and present Christ in that way. And we can't allow the individual to feel as if it's okay to live this lifestyle. We have a responsibility to work as judges within the church. And this goes back to what we talked about last week, judging on the basis of two or three witnesses as the evidence is provided. And again, this is not hypocritical judgment of the Pharisees in Matthew 7 who focused on a speck, ignoring their own log. This is dealing with logs in the eyes of the people within the church, the big issues that need to be dealt with. And as Jesus pointed out in Matthew 18, there is a process to do this and an expectation that it's going to take place. And if it comes right down to it, the final step is purge the evil from among you. As he says in verse 2, remove this man from among you. Or as Jesus said in Matthew chapter 18, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. What we cannot do is just simply allow egregious sinfulness to continue among the group unchecked. allowing individuals to believe that it's okay, that God accepts him, even if he continues to live in that sinfulness, because he will never change otherwise. We cannot allow sinfulness like that to continue and just kind of say to an individual, well, my sinfulness isn't so bad as so-and-so's, so maybe that means I'm okay. Can you see how a little leaven will leaven the whole lump? If somebody's egregious sinfulness is allowed to continue unchecked, everyone else will look and say, well, I see where the standard is, and as long as my sinfulness doesn't match up to how bad his is, then I know that I'm fine. It has to be understood, sinfulness is not meant to be a continuing, ongoing thing within the church. So let me suggest a few things when it regards church discipline from 1 Corinthians chapter 5, things that hopefully I don't really need to say because we understand this. But first of all, sin must be addressed. You know, there's been a movement, and not only in our culture at large, I mean, it's absolutely in our culture at large, but it's even, I believe, infiltrated churches as well. There's kind of this paradigm shift taking place where we begin to say we're all sinners. You know, someone will say, who here is a sinner? And everybody, it's almost like we proudly put up our hands and say, I am. With everybody else, yeah, I'm a sinner. And that's the way that sometimes the discussions come out. And who am I if I'm a sinner? Who am I to judge anybody else? And therefore, nobody has a right to judge anyone else's behavior. And that's absolutely right to a degree, but when it comes to the confines, the context of the church relationship, it's like we're scared that we're going to be seen as hypocrites. Folks, we must hold each other accountable in our behavior as a church. That is part of the reason that the church exists. We have to make these kinds of judgments. Now, this can be horribly, and I believe has been horribly abused, which is why I believe there are checks and balances involved. We need to follow the procedures that Jesus outlined in Matthew chapter 18 to avoid turning this kind of idea into a witch hunt. But we can't be so scared of potential abuse that we never do anything. And therefore, sin that needs to be addressed never gets addressed. In our class this upcoming Wednesday, we're going to talk about Romans 14, a passage which I believe is another one of those checks and balance passages that helps us have an appropriate view of how to handle differences that sometimes people see as sinfulness and whether or not it is. So I'm going to reserve some of this discussion until Wednesday night. But we cannot just take an attitude that says, you know what, Jesus is love, and the loving thing is to show no judgment concerning sin. That is not an accurate portrayal of Jesus. But just remember this. Every single time Jesus ever pointed out sin, I believe it was done in the most loving possible way. And we point out sin with gentleness. We point out sinfulness with care and with love. And it's important that we do so the way that Jesus would. Now, church discipline, let me suggest, is also something that is important for a church. I would not say that if a church never administers discipline, then there's something wrong with that church. I've actually heard some people say that. Hopefully what that means is that it's just being done correctly, and things always kind of work their way out when you get to stage 2. And it never goes on to stage 3 or stage 4, according to Matthew chapter 18. But I will say that if you come into a group, and it doesn't take long to begin to notice all kinds of sinfulness taking place, the kinds of sinfulness that the world looks at and says, man, I thought y'all were Christians, and this is the way y'all act? That's a problematic scenario. Church discipline is a necessary part of what a church sometimes must do. However, church discipline is reserved for those who desire to remain a part of the church. I have memories, my younger years, discussions concerning church discipline or even having it engaged. Usually it went something along these lines. Somebody would stand up, they'd have a formal letter of some sort they would read. So-and-so has not been attending for X amount of time. He's in violation of the command in Hebrews 10:25 to assemble. And he has refused to talk to the preacher. He's refused to talk to the elders. So it's been decided we must withdraw from so-and-so and begin following Paul's teaching. None are to engage with this person or even eat with this person. And honestly, that never sat right with me. Something about it just felt off. And I think it's because even then I could realize this person that they've withdrawn fellowship from, this person does not need the church to ignore them. Quite the opposite. This is the time that that person needs the church to reach out and be a part of them the most. You see, 1 Corinthians 5 does not apply in that situation. It doesn't apply when people have quit the church, when people refuse to be a part of the church. When somebody says, I don't want to be a part of the church any longer, then they have removed themselves from the group, and at this point, 1 Corinthians 5 is not talking about them. 1 Corinthians 5 is talking about the individuals who are a part of the church and still want to live like the world. It has nothing to do with those who leave the church to go be a part of the world. This is different. And I think we need to understand this. These people have left the church. You can't take away membership from them because they have taken their membership away already. And when people leave the group, the last thing that they need is for the group to say, oh, you decided you don't want to be a part of us anymore? That was a good decision because we don't want to have anything to do with you. That's an individual that needs the whole church to come to them and treat them like the one that has gone astray and needs to be brought back in. 1 Corinthians 5 does not apply unless the individual still believes they are a part of the church and are still actively trying to remain a part of the church. We need to be careful not to misapply this passage for such people and end up doing the exact opposite of what love would demand. As we maintained last week, without creating the proper relationships, church discipline cannot effectively work because it's only based on the premise that people want to remain a part of the group. And finally, let me suggest 1 Corinthians 5 is a directive that is given to the church and church relationships. And this kind of goes back to a lesson that I did, I think last year, maybe 2 years ago. I think it's last year, where there are different spheres of sovereignty that we have in our lives, and there's some overlap of them, but they're not all the exact same thing. This is in regards to the relationship that we share with one another, very specifically through Christ. And this could be, with so many other things that are not clearly delineated within Scripture, this could be left up to the discretion of individuals. But let me suggest, this is not dealing with how to handle relationships within your own family. I want to provide for consideration that what is understood here is how you treat an individual who wants to remain a part of the church in their sinfulness. The whole point of being together, even eating together, the whole point of that is to show this person there's nothing wrong. Our relationship which we share together, a relationship in Christ, is just fine. I mean, that's the idea of eating together, and we need to be sure that we show the individual that is not valid. But this is different from the familial relationships that exist on a different level. Even if your family are brothers and sisters in Christ. In other words, this is not a command that says, hey, here's how to treat family members. Now, if your family determines that the only way to help a person who tries to maintain that they still have a relationship with God is to create these kinds of lines within the family, there's certainly a principle here to do that. My point is, this is not a command written to families, or even, I would suggest, friends, unless the relationship that is shared is first and foremost built on the joined relationship in Christ. In other words, by continuing your relationship with an individual, you believe that you are telling them that they are still in a proper relationship with Christ. If you believe that having this relationship gives them that false sense of security, then yeah, it's best to follow what 1 Corinthians 5 has to say. But if you have a relationship with someone in which it is clearly understood, the relationship that I share with you has nothing at all to do with a shared relationship with God through Christ, this passage is not applicable to that. I have and have had many family members not in a proper relationship with Christ. And when necessary, I've made it known that my continued involvement with them is not based on the fact that I see them as a brother or a sister in Christ. Our relationship is on this bond, which is something else. So the point is that this is referring to how a church responds. And this should answer some of those questions that get asked. Well, what about if someone's living in your house? Are you allowed to sit down at a table with them? What happens if you work with someone who, has gone through this? What happens if this? What happens if this? And all of these other questions, just make sure that we are allowing this to be what Paul is saying for it to be. What is vitally important is that even if relationships are maintained, we must make sure that it's known it is not on the basis of a relationship with Jesus. Our relationship does not stem from joint fellowship in Christ. They need to know you do not believe that relationship is still there. Now, we're going to have more to say about this in the future concerning the importance of maintaining relationships. But for now, I want to stress this. The church should be a place that is special. It should be a place that is special to everyone who is a part of it. A place where the fullness of Christ is on display. A place where an individual wants to maintain his place within the group. And in all of this, it should be shown that if someone wants to hold on to their sinfulness, they should also acutely feel that that which is given up, is not worth it. It becomes so much more difficult to choose the flesh over the Spirit when we present the Spirit as something to hold on to. And how we handle these situations following Matthew 18, look into 1 Corinthians 5, if or when they come up, is vitally important, not only for the salvation of the sinful individual, but for the entire church itself. Let us go now to prayer, asking for wisdom as we move forward, in case we run into some of these same kinds of scenarios here at the church at Market Street. Let's pray. Our great and mighty God, our Father, the Creator of all, to you we give honor and praise. We desire to glorify you in our lives and the ways that we live them. And it is now that we come to you giving thanks. We also come asking for your help. Please give us wisdom here. Be with the shepherds of this church and give them wisdom in guiding us. And give us all wisdom as we strive to live our lives to the praise of your glory. as a body united together. We love you, and we thank you for all the blessings that you provide for us. And we especially thank you for your Son, and it is through him we pray. Amen.